We all know how vital the gamma play in Escape from Tarkov is. Most of the time, your raid's performance depends on your graphic settings, which is a variable sometimes triggered by firm eyesight or game performance. Everyone is tired of the stutters or low FPS on bigger maps that could be the main culprit for your death. Well, we're here to help you find the best settings in Escape from Tarkov and hopefully satisfy your needs. Resolution and aspect ratio. These are rather self-explanatory, but here's a brief explanation. Resolution is the number of distinct pixels that can be displayed on a monitor in each dimension. Aspect ratio is a proportion of displayed image's width to its height. The aspect ratio should not have a visible impact on the game's performance, but selecting a value other than your monitor's native will result in black bars on the monitor's sides. High resolutions, however, require better hardware to maintain good frame rates. Set these to match your monitor's native values, unless you really struggle to run the game on at least 30 FPS. Screen mode. This setting determines the mode in which Tarkov will be displayed on your screen. Full screen, Escape from Tarkov, will take up the entire screen of your monitor and have the highest display priority. Important. For this setting, we recommend you to play the game at your desktop resolution. In full screen mode, you will not be able to move your mouse cursor between monitors unless you Alt+Tab the game, which might crash it. It's Tarkov after all, so the setting is discouraged if you use multiple monitors. Windowed. Instead of taking up the whole screen, Escape from Tarkov will run in a window that can be resized, easily minimized, and moved. This allows much better access to other apps you like to run, like voice comms, music players, etc. In this mode, your computer will continue to run other tasks normally, which might negatively impact performance. Windowed borderless. The game launches in a full screen size window without borders, hence the name, that can't be differentiated from the full screen mode at first glance. This mode offers almost as much freedom as windowed mode, while also taking up full screen, which allows you to focus on the game. In this mode, your computer will continue to run other tasks normally, which might negatively impact performance. You will generally get the best performance out of the full screen mode, but it has its problems: mouse locking, problematic Alt+Tabbing. Windowed mode will allow you to get the most freedom at the cost of performance and window borders that are annoying. Borderless windowed mode impacts performance the same way as regular windowed, but it displays the game as if it was full screen. For the best of both worlds, we recommend the borderless windowed display mode. If your rig can't handle it properly, run the game in full screen mode instead. VSync. Vertical synchronization is a graphics technology that synchronizes the frame rate of a game with your monitor's refresh rate. For example, VSync will lock your FPS to 60 if you use 60 Hz monitor to prevent screen tearing. The downside of VSync is it can cause input lag. Moreover, if your computer is not powerful enough to match the frame rate with your monitor's refresh rate, VSync will reduce it even further to synchronize them. VSync can help with graphical fidelity of Tarkov, but it may also cause input lags that are deadly in an FPS game. Basically, when turning on VSync, you are putting yourself at a disadvantage by increasing the time in which the game registers your actions. Turn it off unless you have a very high refresh rate and want to cheat the game's maximum FPS limits. Overall graphics quality. This setting offers a bunch of presets that, in theory, allow you to easily match the game's graphics settings to your PC's capabilities. Changing any of the advanced settings will automatically change this setting's name to custom, but will not alter anything else. However, changing this setting after adjusting any of the advanced ones will overwrite the adjustments with the preset values. Depending on the value, overall graphics quality will have a low to very high impact on the game's performance, as it affects all other graphics settings. Put it on low if working with a low-end PC, medium if working with a mid-range PC build, or high if you run the game on a high-end gaming PC, and adjust all advanced settings afterward. We do not recommend ever setting this on ultra, as it will drain your PC's resources and destroy your frame rate unless you have a monster PC, of course. Texture quality. Rather self-explanatory. The higher the texture quality, the better the resolution of all textures displayed in-game. Putting this to high will make the game look much better, especially while inspecting objects that are close to you. On the other hand, lower texture qualities will take up much fewer resources. Surprisingly, texture quality has a lower performance impact than some other graphics settings, but it still is significant. For maximum performance, put this on low. For maximum looks, put this on high. If you don't care how the game looks and want every advantage you can get, leave this on low. Even if your rig is strong enough to run the game at high graphics settings with good frame rates, higher FPS will lower input lag, and lower texture quality will make enemies somewhat easier to spot. Low-quality textures look terrible from up close, but the difference between high and low is not that noticeable from longer distances. In fact, shadows quality. This setting affects the quality of shadows displayed on your screen. The smaller and more complicated the shadow, the more difference will this setting make when changed from low to high. From our experience, shadows quality has a high impact on the game's performance, even if you own a high-end PC, and puts a significant strain on the graphics card. Put shadows quality on low, even if you have a solid PC, as it will not reduce Tarkov's graphical fidelity that much and ensure that it runs as smoothly as possible. If you have a very solid rig and want to trade some performance for quality, set this to medium. We don't recommend putting shadows quality on high for general gameplay as it has a very significant performance impact unless you have high-end graphics card. Object LOD Quality. Object level of detail quality setting determines how the complexity, resolution, and quality of 3D models changes with their distance to the player or other metrics such as viewpoint relative position or speed in the object's importance. This setting was put in place to improve rendering efficiency by decreasing the strain that the game's graphics put on the GPU without you even noticing. This setting affects how much rendering your GPU has to do at any given time, which means that it will have a substantial impact on the game's overall performance. Put object LOD quality to 2, lowest setting. Chances are, you will not notice the difference most of the time as you focus your attention on the center of the screen. For the best overall quality, put this to 4. This will lower the game's performance, but make it look prettier. Backgrounds and display corners will become more detailed. Overall visibility determines the distance at which objects, players, and terrain features start to render on your screen. If this is set high, you will be able to see objects that are really far away, which is counterproductive on most Tarkov maps, especially those that feature uneven terrain or urban infrastructure. Overall visibility can put a significant strain on your game's performance, especially on the more open maps, and when you take an elevated position, this is also where you will see what this setting really does. Go to reserves dome and fiddle with the setting. You'll immediately see the difference in both frame rate and visibility. For CQB maps and assault mid-range loadouts you can put this on 400 without gimping your performance. For sniper loadouts, you should put this at 1000 to maximize your long-range advantage and to make spotting enemies from a long distance possible. In most cases, putting this setting higher than 1000 only decreases your frame rate. Then again, if you plan on sniping on customs, interchange, or another map that promotes close to mid-range engagements, switch it back to 400. Shadows visibility determines the distance at which objects, players, and terrain features stop to cast shadows. The higher this setting is, the more realistic and immersive the game looks, but at a very high resource cost. At first glance, this might seem to have a performance impact similar to the overall visibility setting, but shadows are dynamic and take up much more resources than regular static objects, which results in them being much more demanding performance-wise. For the maximum performance, put this on 40. If you have a mid-range PC build or better and want the game to look a bit more immersive when traversing more open areas, try setting it to 100 and check if you notice a difference. If not, there's no real point in leaving it on a higher than minimum setting. Someone might argue that putting this on 100 or more will allow you to spot enemies around corners thanks to their shadows sticking out. Well, how likely are you to notice a small shadow on the ground 100 meters in front of you in an environment that features multiple loss-blocking objects? The answer is unlikely, and we're not even mentioning the fact that sun has to be lighting the enemy up from the correct side, and that enemy has to be oblivious of his shadow revealing his position. Anti-aliasing. This setting determines how well the jagged edges on rendered objects are smoothed out. There are a few separate anti-aliasing techniques available in Tarkov, and each of them works a bit differently, which means that each of them has a different performance impact. FXAA. FXAA fast approximate anti-aliasing is not very resource demanding and might be a good option for low-end PC users. It does not take the 3D geometry of objects into account, but rather smooths out the 3D images as they appear on the screen. The downside of FXAA is that it may blur out some of the textures, which results in lower graphical fidelity and enemies being harder to see. Temporal anti-aliasing deals with both temporal aliasing, objects appearing at a location instead of giving the impression of smoothly moving towards the display, i.e. pop-in, and jagged edges with the use of multiple AA techniques at once. This is a very hardware-demanding setting, but it will make the game look much better. TA high. Temporal anti-aliasing high is the regular TA turned up to 11, the most resource-demanding, but also the most effective. If your rig can handle it, don't hesitate to turn this one on as it will greatly improve Tarkov's looks. All objects displayed on your screen are comprised of pixels, and the pixels are square in shape, which results in the so-called aliasing, presence of jagged edges, on all objects that are not rectangular and perfectly vertical horizontal in shape. Pretty much every object you see in the game will have some aliasing on it. FXAA has the lowest impact on the game's performance, but it is also the least effective. Regular TA has a rather high impact on performance, but it yields good results. TA high is the most resource demanding, but also the most effective in getting rid of aliasing. If you run Tarkov on a low-end PC, turn anti-aliasing completely off or use FXAA. Difference between off and FXAA is very minor framerate-wise, but very noticeable graphics-wise. If your PC can handle it, you can choose to go for the TA high, as it makes the game look much better. Regular TA is a nice compromise between looks and performance, so it might be the best option for both mid-range and high-end PC builds. Resampling. Resampling is the process of changing the number of pixels in a digital image. This can be done using different geometric transformations, but the end result is that the game may appear clearer or more blurry depending on the situation. Supersampling increases the number of pixels and downsampling reduces it. 4x and 2x supersampling will make objects look sharper at the cost of consuming resources. Downsampling will save some resources as the game will be forced to downscale the resolution of objects. 1x resampling has no impact on the performance and does not change the quality of displayed digital images. If you want this setting to improve the game's performance, you have to also decrease the screen resolution option. Put this to 1x off, unless you have severe performance problems. Putting this to 4x supersampling will wreck even the strongest PCs. HBAO. Ambient occlusion is a rendering and shading technique used in ambient lighting calculations. It determines how rendered objects are exposed to ambient lighting. AO is a global method, which means that lighting at each point is a function of other shapes in the given area. Horizon-based ambient occlusion uses a physically based algorithm that approximates an integral with depth buffer sampling. HBAO makes the game look much more realistic by simulating real lighting. This, however, eats up a lot of resources and might kill your framerate, especially in open areas. Moreover, turning this all the way up substantially increases your GPU load, which may cause overheating problems in some cases. Turn this off if you run the game on a low-end PC, as it will kill your framerate otherwise. If you are playing on a high-end PC, turning this to high will make the game look much more realistic and immersive. On a mid-range PC, you can try setting this to low, as it is enough to make the game look good without affecting the framerate too much. If you are crazy and have access to monster hardware, you can try very high. SSR. Screen space reflection is a post-processing technique that utilizes screen space data to calculate reflections. The main results of this process are subtle reflections on wet surfaces and objects like shallow puddles of water, but this affects all other shiny objects as well. The reflections are calculated in a way that stimulates real-life reflections. This setting makes a difference, especially during in-game rainy weather, but is much more demanding than regular static lighting. Space screen reflection is a very resource-demanding setting, especially when there is a lot of wet surfaces around. The visible difference between low, medium, and high SSR settings is surprisingly low in most cases. Turn this off to improve the game's overall performance, as the effect that it provides is not that impressive most of the time. In rare cases, like making screenshots or recording videos, turning this to high is a good idea, as it will improve the game's graphical fidelity. In some extremely rare cases, turning this on might help you spot enemies thanks to their reflections. If you want to see reflections for general gameplay experience and immersion improvements, you might want to set this to low if you have a mid to high-end PC. Anisotropic filtering. Anisotropic filtering enhances the image quality of textures on 3D rendered objects that are slanted with respect to the player's view, where the projection of the texture appears to be non-orthogonal. This ensures that textures viewed at different angles have appropriate proportions. In other words, anisotropic filtering reduces texture blur and increases detail sharpness of 3D objects viewed at oblique angles. Anisotropic filtering has a comparatively small impact on the game's performance, but it can improve the way Tarkov looks by a bit. However, the effect is rather subtle and not really noticeable during gameplay. It is one of the options that improve the viewing experience but are not that important from the gameplay experience perspective. If you want to maximize your FPS, turn anisotropic filtering off, but remember that AF's impact on FPS is extremely low and you will not gain much. Otherwise, enable it to make the game look that tiny bit sharper on the corners of your screen. Sharpness. This setting increases the apparent sharpness of all viewed objects. Increasing sharpness makes all objects stand out more against each other, while reducing it results in images becoming more blurry. In other words, the higher the sharpness, the more distinct outlines all displayed objects have. However, high sharpness makes the game look artificial and might even tire your eyes. Fun fact: using painkillers gives you a graphical effect somewhat similar to increasing sharpness. From our experience, sharpness has close to zero effect on Tarkov's performance, despite the fact that it can alter the way objects are displayed on screen quite visibly. This is entirely up to one's preference. However, sharper object outlines might make it easier to spot enemies and moving objects. For this reason, you might want to fiddle a bit with this setting by playing for a bit with a default value and then increasing it gradually to determine what sharpness is optimal for your ability to distinguish objects from each other quickly, especially when there's a lot of foliage in the background. LOD FPS Limit. Self-explanatory. As you can imagine, this does not affect the game's in-raid frame rate at all. At least not directly. The higher the FPS, the more work is required from your PC to process them, which in turn raises the temperature of its components. If you have severe overheating problems, adjusting LOD FPS limits might help to cool your rig a bit between raids, but the difference will be rather marginal and extremely short-lived, as lobby screens do not put that much strain on your hardware anyway. PC heats up much faster during a raid. Investing in proper cooling is the only way of reliably dealing with excess heat. Just set this to 60, it will make your inventory management experience a bit smoother without affecting the game's overall performance. Game FPS Limit. As self-explanatory as LOD FPS Limit, but much less trivial. You can raise this up to 120, but it does not guarantee that the game will run at that value. The actual amount of FPS depends on other settings and your PC's specs. This is where everything gets flipped over. The game's frames per second do not have an impact on its performance, but are rather the performance's reflection. The goal of adjusting every single Tarkov graphics setting to its most optimal value is, ultimately, gaining as many FPS out of the game as possible, so setting this under its max value is counterproductive. Put this at 120. Z-Blur. This feature will blur images on your screen while you sprint or quickly turn. Its goal is to increase immersion as rapid movements make focusing your eyes on objects difficult. In reality, however, this can make spotting enemies while turning or sprinting much more difficult and thus affect your PvP. This has no visible impact on performance. Moreover, according to Tarkov's official forums, this setting is simply unnecessary, as most of the monitors will blur the image because of the non-ideal work of the LCD matrix anyway, which means that this option makes sense only if you have a high-end LED monitor. Turn this off as it does not make any difference and may put you on a disadvantage in the extreme cases. Chromatic Aberrations. In optics, a failure of a lens to focus all colors at the same point is called chromatic aberration. It is caused by incorrect color refraction on the lens and manifests as distorted blue, red, or green lines along the edges of displayed objects. In photography, chromatic aberrations are, in most cases, seen as unwanted artifacts that greatly reduce image quality and are often removed in image post-processing or by employing certain photography techniques and using the correct equipment. In Tarkov, all this setting does is it makes objects look a bit out of focus, and it has a close to zero impact on the game's performance. It can also make spotting enemies a bit more difficult. Turn it off unless you are trying to pursue a cinematic feel for some reason and want to make the game look like it was recorded with an old or not properly maintained camera. Noise. This setting simulates the film grain, which is a result of the presence of small metallic silver particles or dye clouds and manifests as random optical textures. This effect is common in old photographs and movies. If you want to check how it manifests and how it can be used on purpose to simulate old and raw images made with classic cameras, we recommend you to rewatch Saving Private Ryan, where film grain was used, together with some other techniques that make the image look faded on purpose to achieve original War Chronicle-like effect. This setting has close to zero impact on the game's performance, but it can affect how the game looks on your screen. It provides the classic cinematic looks and likens Tarkov to an old movie. Turn this off unless you want that classic cinematic feel during gameplay. Grass shadows. Self-explanatory. This adds shadows to the grass. This is not very noticeable most of the time, unless you go prone in high grass. Grass shadows have a comparatively minor impact on the game's performance, however, they may make it harder to aim at enemies while lying prone in the grass. Turn this off to gain a little FPS boost and make camping, I mean playing very defensively, easier. Chances are, you will not notice the difference, anyway. Remember, in online FPS games, performance should always come before looks. You should aim at getting at least 60 stable frames per second in any in-game area, which means that you should get no less than 80 on average, as frames like to drop suddenly, from time to time, in Tarkov. Stable FPS values will improve your gameplay experience massively. Unless you don't mind playing the game at below 60 FPS and being put at a disadvantage because of this, of course. Well, that's all for me, I hope I helped you. If yes, then I ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. This inspires me to create new videos for you. See you soon, friends.